It was 1906 in Los Angeles, California. Reverend William J. Seymour had just arrived and was eager to begin preaching. His messages focused on the restoration of biblical spiritual gifts and was initially rejected, but eventually found a group of believers in a home on Bonnie Brae Street and later in a rundown building on Azusa Street, which they named the Apostolic Faith Mission. A 3-year revival attracted people from around the world who came to experience this new outpouring of God's Spirit. The revival would later be credited with launching Pentecostalism to the world. A few years later, in April of 1914, a new Pentecostal denomination was formed. The first General Council of the Assemblies of God met in Hot Springs, Arkansas. 300 delegates from a variety of independent churches and church networks, including the Apostolic Faith Movement, held meetings to unify under a common doctrine, establish a mission enterprise, as well as a ministerial training school. A few more years pass and times become difficult. World War I had been raging in Europe for years, and America had begrudgingly been pulled into it. Hundreds of thousands of young American men were shipped overseas, not knowing what the future would hold for them or their families. Going with these men was a flu pandemic that would eventually kill an estimated 50 million people across the world. In the midst of this turmoil, Reverend W.R. Potter was led to open a new church in Long Beach, California called Pentecostal Mission. This is where the story of Christian Life Church begins. The Roaring '20s was a time of great expansion in America. World War I was behind us, and there was a great sense of optimism. The time saw the wide adoption of amazing new inventions and technologies, from automobiles and telephones to radio and household electricity. And even commercial aviation became a routine part of people's lives. The country was riding a wave of success that was only beginning to show the signs of the unimaginable trials it would soon face. Pastor Potter continued to lead the Pentecostal mission, and in 1921 officially incorporates the church under the name Pentecostal Assembly of Long Beach. This action was the starting point of the 100th anniversary we celebrate today. The following years brought revival to Pentecostal Assembly. In 1924, a revival created an opportunity to unify with another local body of believers and create a combined church that would be named Central Gospel Tabernacle. For a brief period, Pastor Potter would co-pastor with Pastor McAllister. During this co-pastorate, the church bought a former Methodist church located at the corner of 10th in California, where it would stay for the next 15 years. In 1928, under the leadership of Pastor George Jeffrey, Central Gospel Tabernacle officially joined the Assemblies of God Fellowship. Pastor Jeffrey would serve the church through 1935, guiding it through the most trying years of the Great Depression. In 1936, Central Gospel Tabernacle elected a new pastor. Her name was Emma Taylor. Reverend Taylor would lead the fellowship for the next 19 years, one of the longest pastorates in the church's history. The 1940s began with yet another world war raging in Europe, but this time in Asia as well. The Great Depression was finally over, and while building war supplies for the Allies was providing jobs for Americans, the December 7, 1941 attack on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii made it impossible for the United States to stay out of the conflict any longer. Again, millions of American soldiers from Long Beach and around the country left their homes to fight a war like none before it. After 6 long years, World War II ended. Over 70 million people had lost their lives, 3% of the world's population at the time, and many countries were devastated. But God preserved America. In the late 40s and 50s was again a time of great prosperity. In 1940, Pastor Taylor and Central Gospel Tabernacle faced a major challenge. The building on 10th in California had been condemned, and the congregation was forced to find a new place to meet. God opened a door just down the street at 10th and Linden at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Central Gospel Tabernacle shared the facility for 1 year, after which God made a way for the building to be purchased and it to become the new home of the church for the next 30 years. In 1948, as the Long Beach area was seeing a boom in employment and urban development, the church began a major construction project to remodel and enlarge the facility, and in September 1950, they dedicated it to God's service. In 1955, Reverend Thomas Cunningham became pastor and changed the church's name once again, this time to First Assembly of God, Long Beach. In 1958, Reverend Fulton Buntain became the pastor of First Assembly until 1965, when he left to serve as an official in the Southern California district of the Assemblies of God. Pastor Buntain was the first of 2 pastors who would go on to work at the district office. In 1965 brought a new pastor to First Assembly with an expanded vision for reaching the Long Beach community for Christ. Reverend Wesley Steelberg and the church board realized there was little room for growth at the current location on East 10th Street. While to the west side of Long Beach, the new San Diego Freeway had just been built, bringing an enormous amount of daily traffic through the area. Having a location next to the new freeway would be ideal, but where? About this time, a 2-acre site next to the freeway covered in oil wells became available, but at a steep cost, over $300,000. The church decided to sell their current property, and before it was even on the market, St. Mary's Hospital inquired about purchasing. The negotiated price was $320,000. 3400 Pacific Avenue would be the site of the new church. This miracle would be the first of 5 as Pastor Steelberg and the congregation of First Assembly started a multi-year process to build the facility we enjoy today. The property had been purchased, but all the finances needed to construct the building still had to be found. The board reached out to more than 50 lending institutions to secure financing. Every one of them turned the church down. After a time of prayer, the board went to the congregation and asked for their help through a bond buying program. The church responded in short order and bought $300,000 worth of bonds. Miracle number 2. While this wasn't the total amount needed for construction, it was enough to convince Gus and Ken Walker, the president and chairman of Farmers and Merchants Bank of Long Beach. They would service the bond program and provide an additional $150,000. Miracle number 3. Construction began in late 1970, and the property started to take shape, but the challenges were not over. Initial cost estimates were low, and it was determined an additional $150,000 would be needed to complete the building. Farmers and Merchants Bank once again came through with half of the additional funds and counseled the church on how to raise the balance through promissory notes from members and friends. With the assistance of Oral Kern, the church's longtime business manager, $329,000 in promissory notes was collected, enough to finish the building. Miracle number 4. On October 10th, 1971, Christian Life Church opened for the first time. After years of prayer, work, and struggle, the church had a new home. The first 3 years in the new facility were difficult financially. More debt had to be taken on to pay the interest of the various loans, and in October 1974, Pastor Steelberg suffered a massive heart attack. A year later, on doctor's advice, Pastor Steelberg resigned as pastor of Christian Life Church. However, before he left, he saw the start of the church's financial turnaround. In 1975, no additional funds were borrowed. $22,500 in notes were repaid, and the overall debt was reduced by $43,000. Miracle number 5. Pastor Steelberg's 10 years as leader of Christian Life Church dramatically affected the future of the fellowship and set it on a path for success that 50 years later is still impacting the Long Beach community. In October 1976, CLC elected a new young pastor named T. Ray Rachels. Pastor Rachels would lead CLC through a time of explosive growth and develop the church into one of the most respected in the Southern California district of the Assemblies of God. In 1985, just before leaving CLC to accept a leadership position at the SoCal district office, Pastor Rachels and the congregation of CLC had another meeting with Gus Walker from Farmers and Merchants Bank. This time, Mr. Walker presented Pastor Rachels with a mortgage note that was paid in full. With the departure of Pastor Rachels to the district office, Christian Life Church once again was looking for a new senior pastor. In 1986, the church elected Reverend Don Spradling to the position, which he held until early 2005. The church continued to enjoy God's favor and was able to pay off the remaining promissory notes in 1990. As a debt-free church, CLC poured even more resources into missions, supporting over 80 different missionaries and missionary organizations. While CLC has been blessed with many gifted pastors, a pastor without an engaged congregation will not succeed. Christian Life Church has a long tradition of talented members who went above and beyond, volunteering vast amounts of their time and talents to the church and to God. Today, we highlight 3 of those members who loved the church and gave their all to see it succeed. Orla Kern was the secretary-treasurer of the church for 49 years. He served under 6 pastors, from Emma Taylor to Don Spradling. His financial management helped the church not only build this facility, but also pay off its debts. Additionally, he lobbied the city of Long Beach to build a Metrolink station near the church. Today, there is a station at Wardlow and Pacific because of Orla's efforts. One of the pastors that Orla worked with described him this way: Orla was a great mix of strength and meekness. He was loyal to the church and to the pastors he worked with. His word was his bond. Gloria Clowes led the nursery ministry at CLC for over 40 years. Her undying love and patience for the youngest attendees of the church allowed countless mothers the opportunity to focus on the service because they knew their child was in the best of hands. The nursery is a vital ministry in every church. However, very few can say they had someone like Gloria at the helm. Gloria's defining characteristics of authentic kindness and loyalty to her ministry make her a wonderful example of God's love to us all. Lou Rice knew this building better than anyone. In more than 30 years of volunteer service maintaining the property, he did everything from lawn sprinklers to the neon lights on the steeple cross. When Mike Hinojosa became senior pastor, Lou wanted to give him a tour of the building, which included the steeple. In his mid-70s, Lou was scampering up the ladder inside the steeple trunk until Pastor Mike waved him off. He was more than happy to take Lou's word that everything up there was in order. Lou was a kind and genuine person. He loved life, people, and the church, and made the most of every day. Each of these extraordinary members of Christian Life Church have similar characteristics. They are authentic, kind, dedicated individuals that love the church. The impact of their lives on this body of believers will never be fully known. In 2005, Pastor Mike Hinojosa became the senior pastor of Christian Life Church. Pastor Mike had previously been youth pastor at CLC before going on to lead Faith Tabernacle Church in West Los Angeles for 11 years. Now in his 16th year at CLC, Pastor Mike has faithfully shepherded this church, even through another flu pandemic reminiscent of what Reverend Potter faced more than 100 years ago at the start of the fellowship. Through trials and victories for 100 years, this church has been a consistent beacon for Christ to Long Beach and around the world. 10 pastors have led thousands of members to a greater understanding of Christ and trained children and youth to know and trust God. May God continue to bless and keep this church for His service until His return. Happy 100th anniversary, Christian Life Church.